Daniel Lewis is the Dibner Senior Curator for the History of Science and Technology at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in Pasadena, California. A native of Hawaii, he's an environmental historian and author whose latest book, 12 Trees, The Deep Roots of Our Future, is due to be released on Avid Reader Press, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, in March of 2024. On top of his duties at the library, he's also a part-time professor at Caltech, and he's here today to talk about the library, the nature and practice of research writing, and his latest work. This is the Bang Goes the Universe interview with Daniel Lewis. Dan Lewis, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ron. It's really great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. So full disclosure for everybody watching or listening, I have been a reader at the library for many years. I used it extensively. I used the histories there extensively for research for my first two books. And that is, Dan, the reason why I really wanted to have you come on the show, because I think I get a lot of questions about, how do you get started? We'll get to this. But I just thought, somebody with your background and experience on both sides of this issue, I think it'd be really, really a good thing to have you on. And I'm really glad you came on. So thanks again.
Delighted, Ron.
So for those first, let's just start with, for those listening or watching, can you just talk briefly about the library and the collections, just so everybody has a kind of an overview of, at least your department?
Yeah, so it's funny because the Huntington Library is very well known to people in many circles, and in some ways it's actually better known to people in Europe, we've discovered, than it is to locals. But it's one of the world's great independent research libraries, and it happens to be parked on the grounds of a 200-acre botanical garden. And the garden is really the public draw, so we get about 1 million people a year onto the grounds to enjoy the spectacular different themed botanic gardens here, the desert garden, the cactus garden, the Japanese garden, and so on. But the research library is less known unless you're a scholar working in one of our areas. And then it's the ne plus ultra of research, because among other things, we give out about 200 fellowships a year for full-time study, which is, we're the biggest fellowship granting library in North America, if not in the world. And so these fellows that are long-term fellows are here for anywhere from a month to a year. And so there's sort of a research community here. And then there are all the people that just show up on their own dime, as it were, or that are local to use the collections. And we have a number of particular strengths in the library. So the history of science and technology, which is my field, is really a great, rich area. It's one of the great strengths of the library, and one of the great collections in the world in the topic. British history, I think it's safe to say we have the biggest collection of materials on the early modern period in England, from the 17th century up to the 18th century in the world outside of England. California and the American West is a great strength of ours. The Pacific Rim is something we, and more recently, have really taken up with vigor as a useful research topic. And then there are others. We have a curator of literary collections. We have a curator of rare books who is a specialist on just the stuff that makes it rare books, the printing, the pages, the bindings, all the material evidence in books that we can use to understand how people have really studied knowledge over centuries. And so it's a lot of fun to work here. There's always something on. There's a million things in the collection that even after 20 years here, I run across things that just I'm gobsmacked by. My jaw just drops, because you just can't imagine what you're going to turn across here. We have probably 12 million items in the collection, so there's a lot of stuff here, and it's really a lot of fun to work here.
It must be, and I just, having worked there some, I have had those moments where I'm leafing through something and I can't believe I'm leafing through what I'm leafing through. I mean, it's just, we know this from research, and anybody who's done research will understand this. When you turn something over that underscores something you've been working on for a while, and really kind of prove to yourself that, you know, what you're working on is going to be worth something to people. It's just, it's an incredible find, and the library's loaded with it. And does all of that or most of that take place in Munger, or are there other buildings and other, I mean, there are galleries and other buildings in the on the grounds as well, correct?
Yeah, so that's an important point about the Huntington. So we're an institution of really 3 or 4 parts. So there's the research library, there's the botanic gardens, which really are a big operation, and we're not just a public-facing botanic garden. We also have a really rich research component there. So we have research botanists and research biologists and plant cryogenics experts, and we have a woman on staff who's the world's authority on conifers, and so there's a lot of sort of research. I don't want to call it churn because there's sometimes negative implications with it. There's a lot of research activity that takes place in the botanic division, and then there's the art collections, the art museum, which contains some really incredible paintings. Blue Boy is one of our most famous paintings. And then a few years ago, we commissioned Kehinde Wiley, who did Obama's presidential portrait, to do a modern, up-to-date version of Blue Boy. So it sits in the gallery. He's a black man across from a white man. He's sitting across from him in the same gallery space. So so the art division is an important component to all of the things that we do here as well.
Incredible. And who was Harry Huntington?
So Henry Huntington was, people often refer to him as a railroad magnate. He was actually the nephew of Collis Huntington, who was a railroad magnate in a different kind of way. Collis Huntington was one of the big 4 of classic American railroading fame, among the people who finished the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. And Henry Huntington was his favorite nephew. And in a strange turn, when Collis died, Henry married his wife, who was his aunt. And jaws flapped at the time, but they weren't related by blood. They were about the same age. She'd been much younger than Collis. And so Henry got half of Collis's fortune and Arabella got the other half. And so this fortune reunited, and Huntington built this property here. And starting in 1903, when he bought the property, he finishes this beautiful Beaux-Arts mansion around 1910. It's the biggest house on the West Coast when it's finished. And it now houses the European art galleries here. The American art has its own separate set of buildings. And so Huntington really is our founder. He loves Southern California. He loves books. He wasn't a scholar per se. He was really a man of the people, despite his wealth in a lot of ways. He had a humble upbringing, a modest education. And so the Huntington's an institution of many parts, you know, and in a way, getting your head around the entity that is the Huntington takes a little doing, because we have such disparate parts, but we all work towards one Huntington, as it were, all the time.
Right. And how is it funded?
So we have a sort of a 3-legged stool upon which our finances rest, which helped us a lot during the pandemic. So if one of those legs, it's not a perfect analogy, because if you lose one leg of a 3-legged stool, it's still going to tip over, right? But that said,
yeah.
So admission to the property, you know, at a million people a year is really significant for us. And then we have an endowment that throws off whatever endowments throw off for income. And then we have charitable contributions from our supporters. So we have something like 50,000 member households that are members of the Huntington. So we consider that part of the charitable contribution side of things for the institution. So it gives us some variety among funding. So if one dips, you know, we're I think it's safe to say we're relatively stable financially. I don't think anyone would characterize us as rich. It's very expensive to run this place. And to do all the things we do, you know. So, you know, there's a misconception upon people walk onto the grounds, and we have a lot of amazing looking stuff, because we do, and it's a beautiful place. But that doesn't mean we're like the Getty, you know, or some other entity that really has a multi-billion-dollar endowment. We don't. So we work hard to keep up with things, I think it's safe to say.
Yeah. Okay. Partnerships. I've always thought that the library was kind of connected with Caltech, but I may be wrong about that. But I understand USC might be a partner. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah. So Caltech is a partner, and we've been looking for quite a ways to find common ground with them. We have a founder in common. So George Ellery Hale, who came here really about the same year as Henry Huntington, was entranced with Southern California and with Pasadena in particular. And Hale founded, he really founded what would become Caltech. It was called the Troop Polytechnic Institute. And it was a large trade school, basically. And Hale kind of slimmed it down size-wise and then professionalized it and turned it into a school for science and engineering and into what would become Caltech shortly thereafter. And so, right. But Hale was also one of our first trustees. And Hale gets some credit for persuading Huntington to turn this into a research library for the people rather than give it to, say, LA County, which was one of Huntington's original plans. Would have been a terrible idea. So, so Caltech and we have ties. I'm on the faculty at Caltech. I teach courses in environmental humanities for them. I teach, and I have other doings. We ran a Caltech Huntington Institute in the History of Science and Technology a few years ago for 3 years, funded by a donor that liked both institutions. You know, USC really is one of our more regular partners. We have 2 institutes. There's the Institute on California in the West, and then there's the Early Modern Studies Institute, which is British history. Okay. So those are our 2 partners. But we're trying really to reach out to, in a more populist way, to audiences like local schools, inner city schools, and to give people who don't normally have an experience like the Huntington a chance to come here and to see some of the amazing things. And just to have a peaceful time on the grounds is great for people. So
yeah, to anybody listening at home who might be interested in doing research there, that is one of the best aspects of doing the work of working here at the library is those long lunch hours walking through the botanical gardens. It couldn't be more serene. It couldn't, if you need to check out for a minute, there's no better place. It's fantastic. Yeah, the point you made about Hale is interesting. I think my research, it came out that Hale, who had graduated MIT, was trying to convince Huntington that this Troop could end up being kind of the MIT of the West, and that was part of the the way he was trying to promote it and being a great promoter.
Yeah, Ron, you know a lot about Hale, I know, and the astronomy culture that evolved out of Hale and his work up at Mount Wilson. I know you know perhaps more than I do.
Well, it's quite a good segue, because I was going to mention the fact that if for those who are interested in the history of Mount Wilson Observatory and or Palomar and observatories they were affiliated with, like the Lowell, like the Lick, like Harvard, there are a lot of manuscripts available by directors and by astronomers at all of those institutions, to and from. Mostly they are corresponding with people who are at Mount Wilson, but that's an extensive library collection of those manuscripts. And I know this firsthand, as you said, it's really great for that. Anything you want to add to that part of it?
So before I go into some astronomy particulars, let me just say, if you want to use the Huntington as a researcher now, it's really much easier than it used to be. And as I like to say, this is going to sound cynical, isn't the right word. What you really need to be here is you need a project and you need a pulse. And you have to be 18. But it used to be that sounds funny to say, but it's true. It used to be you used to have to be advanced to candidacy for the PhD or hold the PhD, and you needed 2 letters of reference from people, and that's a high bar to clear. And it's an elitist thing. And the double-edged sword at a research library is always access versus preservation. So you want to protect the materials from excessive handling and use by people who are they're just curious, and that's not that's hard on the materials. And so, but now we've had this policy in place for I think a couple of years now, and it's proved to work very well. So even if you're an undergraduate, if you're a high school student who's 18, you could come in. But we want people to have a particular project so that they can make best use of our resources, and we have a regular way to help them navigate the collection. So, but let me just say the astronomy stuff here is really amazing. We have the Mount Wilson directors papers here. And so the directors of Mount Wilson, starting with Hale, and we have them from 1903 all the way up to about 1990. I think they probably are holding on to some of the more recent things. Wow. But then there's a lot of other astronomy material here. We have their rare book collection, which runs to about 2,000 volumes. It includes Galileo's Sidereus Nuncius, which is the birth announcement for the telescope from 1610. He publishes this book in March of 1610. He prints 550 copies. It just spread like wildfire over the continent in Europe, and suddenly in a way, because of that book, the telescope is born, or at least knowledge of the telescope is spread wide. It was actually invented in 1608 or so, before the book. But Hale was like the bullhorn for this big deal, the telescope.
Right.
Of course, it's changed everything for our study of the night skies, right?
Indeed. Yeah, that's great. I wasn't aware of that. I might have to happen back for some of that. What about grants and fellowships? Are there is there available money? I understand that's pretty competitive, but do you want to talk about that for folks who are maybe in a position to apply?
Yeah, so these 200 fellowships that we give out, those do tend to go to more typical academics, just because the fellowship process is competitive. And so I should know the percentage that we fund, and because it's certainly public record, but I don't. We probably fund. I mean, this could be wrong, but I think it's probably on the order of 30% of the, or 25% or 30% of the people who apply get funded. It might be less than that. It's not more than that. Yeah. But because it's a competitive process, but we take fellowships for very broad and very specific projects, and we really want people to have a particular. We want things to be of high quality. We want them to be impactful research projects that help inform a broader narrative of scholarship and research. But so of these 200 fellowships I mentioned, so they're in different categories, and some are named fellowships. Some are just meant for. We give up many dozens of 1-month fellowships because they're cheaper for us, of course. Mm-hmm. And the fellowship application deadline every year is November 15th. It's the same every year. So right around now, the last 2 weeks, I've gotten a flurry of emails from people who waited till the last minute to apply. Sure. And it's funny because they also are sort of coy about why they want to know. They'll say they don't say they're applying for a fellowship. I don't know why. They'll often say, I'm interested in researching something. What do you have on that? And so I'll say, well, if you're applying for a fellowship,
yeah.
And we end up with, as I said, a couple hundred fellows a year, and they often come back then on their own dime in subsequent years. And you can also apply for repeat fellowships. So if you win one year, there's no ding to apply another year. And in my personal opinion, it's probably a good thing when you reapply, because you've already cleared the bar once and you're a known quantity. So we have many people who come back multiple times on fellowships here over the years.
Right. Okay. What about activities aligned with the research that you're doing at the facilities? Are there requirements for being engaged, and if not, what kinds of activities are going on within the research community?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It used to be in the olden days being like 10 years ago or more, perhaps, we really required people that were here, at least when we were covering their costs through these fellowships, to actually spend most of their time in the reading room. But we found that, it's not that. I mean, the Southern California is a great hub for other kinds of research, and Caltech is nearby, and USC is nearby, and UCLA is not that far away, and many other research libraries that are useful to scholars working here are within striking distance. And so people occasionally go off on a foray for a day or so to some other institution to do research. We like them to be here generally as much as possible. The other thing that happens, though, is if you're one of the long-term fellows, you're probably working on a long-form project like a book, and people need time to write as well as research. So we don't expect them to be parked in our reading room every day, all day long, because we want them to be able to have time to write. And so all the fellows have an office of differing shape, sizes, and configurations. Some have windows, some have no windows. Focus is the mind, And so we encourage people to do writing as well as research. And as you know, the whole writing and research process is recursive. So you write, you research, you put some more things down on paper, you write, you research, and so on. And so
scratch off. You wonder what you were thinking that day. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
That's right. So it's a moving target. And so and then we have a reader's coffee every Tuesday. So we can get together in a social setting, and they get together. We have a restaurant here as well. They get together on Friday afternoons, often for a drink, to sit around and talk. It's very, very informal. And so they're relatively ad hoc, but they form a community, and they often will do their own things, that aren't sort of Huntington sanctioned. They'll get together and visit with each other. Oh, I want to mention one other thing, Ron, that just has come to light. So Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner, just gave us $40 million to build a residential facility here for researchers for
Wow.
fellowships. So we're going to build our own housing on this
Wow.
property for people. And it solves a long-standing problem, which is finding housing in the very expensive little community in which the Huntington is located. San
I have
Marino
experienced those difficulties
yeah,
myself. Yeah.
exactly. You know, and so this solves the problem by being able to house people right here on campus with full. You know, so that we're excited about that. And then,
Wow. When is that breaking ground? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think we have the money. I think it's probably relatively soon, but we're also in the throes of planning a really big library expansion here, and so I don't know how that is going to work. It's in a different part of the property, but there's just a lot going on here, construction planning wise these days.
Since I started researching there, I guess 20 years ago, just about 20 years ago.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah.
Time goes by.
Yeah. Which you know the beginnings of very well. Just the entrance has changed quite a lot. Once you get into the grounds, it feels like home when I go. I was just there not that long ago. And the restaurant in the back is just lovely, and it really is a nice, like I said earlier, I think just if you need to check out for a minute, it's really not, even if you just need to check out, you just want to go someplace that's as beautiful a spot as you can find on planet Earth. That's a good spot to try out if you're in LA.
It's true. It's true. You know, one other thing I'll say, Ron, is that one of the things that happens is when people are here on fellowships, at least, or just really just our general audience, they're in a really good mood.
Yeah.
Because if they're academics, they've been released from their home institutions for some time to do some research. And, you know, research is the heart and soul for a lot of people's work. And so they're doing it because they really want to do it and they really want to be here and they're driven to be here.
Yeah.
Unless they're like a really beleaguered grad student who's under the gun and is struggling to finish a project, people are usually really happy to be here. So what that means is that people are generally in a really good mood when they're here. So it's fun to work with people like that, right?
Yeah, and the energy, that gives you even more energy. There's nothing better than working in a positive environment. That's just true. It really is nice. I remember my wife trying to reel me back to the East Coast. I would come out here and I don't think I'm getting back on the plane. I don't know what to tell you. You're going to have to figure something out. Get over here. Anyway, the digital collection. Let's talk about that for a minute, because again, when I started, I did research there on and off for 10 or 12 years through the 2 books that I put out, based on the magic that you guys have over there in your collections. But the digital collection was, especially when I started, you were basically following a real paper trail. And I just wondered if that, I know that has been developed over the years, and just, can you update us on where we're at? Can you work remotely pretty effectively these days, or do you still need to come to the library for some of it?
You can. So we have a digital library. It's hdl.huntington.org. HDL stands for Huntington Digital Library. And then we have we have a lot of, excuse me, what are called discovery tools online. So there's something called the Online Archive of California, which hosts finding aids, which are documents that let you look through in a very granular fashion to see the details of collections. And we have many hundreds of our collections are up. Their finding aids are up on the Online Archive of California, which is a UC, University of California hosted website that has not just our finding aids, but hundreds of other repositories in California. It's not that the content has to be California based, it's that the repositories have to be California based. So those are a super useful tool. In terms of actually looking at digital content out of the collections, we have many things that are available. Caltech, the Huntington, and the Carnegie Observatories of Washington got together a few years ago, and we digitized the entire microfilm of George Ellery Hale's papers. And Hale's papers are split between Caltech and the Huntington for obscure historical reasons. They were given to our institutions as separate collections, even though they're really the same body of their Hale's correspondence, right? And so we decided that we'd get together and we'd work out a plan to digitize the actual microfilm that consists of Hale's letters, notebooks, correspondence, incoming and outgoing.
Right.
And then put it up on a Caltech server so people could get at it. So we found the microfilm master, the original negative master, and we jointly funded it among our 3 institutions. We had it digitized, and so now you can get that online. So, the other thing though that's true is that, as I used to say, Huntington has one foot firmly in the 19th century, and the other one's dragging slowly into the 21st century. We haven't collected. We often haven't collected modern materials because there's still a lot of material in the 20th century that's non-digital material that we have desires about adding to the collections. And so, the biggest place probably where we have digital materials that come in that are born digital materials, emails, digital documents, and so on, is in the literary collections, because as we collect writers' papers, and they're, as we like to say, the only good donor is a dead donor. Because then we can manage their materials without their own well-intentioned intervention, I guess is one way to put it.
Okay.
So we have material. We have something called the virtual reading room, where you can actually remotely zoom in, and someone will turn a page in a document for you.
Oh, no kidding! Wow,
for an hour at a time. It's super useful. I don't know of anyone else that's doing this, and it's called the virtual reading room. And you make an appointment, and somebody sets you up with a camera, and then you can say, you turn to the next page, next page, or stop, or then you can say, I'd like a copy of that page. So that is a super useful thing, and we started that during the pandemic because nobody could come here. So
yeah. The pandemic forced us to make some interesting creative choices, and some of them seem to have really worked out. That's incredible. I didn't know that service was offered now.
It's not well known enough. I'm glad to have a chance to say something about it, because it's just not well known enough. And so as you can imagine, it's super useful.
Right. How would you go about? Is there a link to that on the website? I'm guessing.
Yeah. If you go, it's a little torturous, but if you go to the Huntington, if you just Google Huntington Library using the library, there's a page called Using the Library, and I think somewhere on that page is a link to the. You probably don't want me Googling this in real time as we're talking. Well, I can and I will.
Yeah, that particular, using the library, for those who are interested in this, that's the first place you go. And you really do see a drop down of the various things that you can kind of do. And if you just spend a half an hour going through that, you'll find your way into all kinds of different photographic material and other collections and finding aids and so forth. Yeah, it's.
And then the other link is catalog.huntington.org, and that'll take you to the catalog of all of our printed items and many thousands of our manuscript items. I see now, if you go to the Using the Library page, there's one called Virtual Reading. There's a link right there called Virtual Reading Room, and it says schedule an appointment to view rare materials via a mediated streaming document camera from anywhere. And then you just click schedule an appointment, and bada bing, bada boom.
Fabulous. All right. So I want to switch gears now and talk more about the writing side, the nature of writing. We've talked, I think, pretty extensively about research, and specifically research at your institution. But I get a lot of questions, and I'm sure you do too. Most writers that I talk to get these same questions from people who might be interested. They've thought about it before. Maybe they're really interested. And the first of which is the most obvious, which is, where do you get your ideas? And the kind of the standard 101 answer to that seems to be, write what you know. I would amend that to write what you love. Certainly didn't know anything about astronomy, not much about astronomy, not nearly as much as I know now when I started into the research at the Huntington. But I did have an affinity for it. I did and I grew a serious passion out of that really kept me going during the, in any research project. There's the highs and lows. You're not getting someplace and you're looking for you kind of plateau. But what's your take on that? On ideas and, how to flow that?
I mean, I really love that. Write what you love, Ron, because that's exactly right. Because write what you know isn't always successful, because a lot of people know a lot of stuff and they're not that passionate about it. I know a lot about the history of civil engineering. I'm never going to write a book about it.
Right.
I just don't. I just am not,
Yeah.
one of the great things about being a historian in particular is it is such a bully pulpit because everything has a history, right? And so what you can do as a historian is you can take a subject you're obsessed with, and in my case, it's been birds for the most part, and I can write about its history, and then I can also write about many of its current day doings, right? And so
Right.
I think that is the right starting point, is to really figure out what your obsessions are, and then figure out what you might have to say about them. And I found personally that it's very challenging. I like to write books. I'm not big on short form things, although I've written a lot of articles, but it's not my
Yeah.
favorite mode of writing.
Right.
But for my money, writing a book is really what's most rewarding. And finding a topic that hasn't been written about before in book form is really hard. I've had
Yeah.
many ideas I've come up with, and then I've had to set aside once I've investigated the topic more and found that someone's already written exactly the book I had in mind. I was going to write a book on the history of the fingerprint. Done.
Done.
Wrote a brilliant book. I was going to write a book on the history of rain.
Yeah.
My wife said, no one is going to read a book on the history of rain. And sure enough, somebody wrote a book, and it's brilliant. I don't think I could have done as good a job of it as she did. So that's half the battle for me, is finding something that no one's done. And I'm doing that right now. I'm trying to spin up a new book proposal at this very moment, and I'm struggling a little bit because I think I found something now that people will be interested in. That's relatively fresh, but it's not easy. It's a big world out there, and people have written a lot.
Yeah, there has been a lot of writing. I mean, of course, you can update books. I tend to agree with you on the article writing. I think the challenge is different, and that can be fun. If I've written several articles for different astronomy magazines, for instance, and it's usually a fun challenge to kind of get an idea into 1,800 words or so. But
for sure.
I much prefer the long format myself. And I was talking, you and I were talking not that long ago about, the same idea about, how do you find, I think that's a bigger challenge than, the most challenging aspect of writing finding a subject is finding a subject that either hasn't been written about for a long time and may need updating, or just really find something that falls between the cracks. And I agree, that's a good point. Very
well,
difficult.
you made a really great one of the perhaps an exception of this idea that is that it's hard to find something is to write a biography of somebody.
Yes.
And you had a great turn with that with the Mule Skinner and the Stars, because then you're talking about, when you're talking about people rather than topics, there are lots of ways to go. Even if people have written a biography of somebody, for instance, it's bound to be different than what you have in mind. And so biography is a little bit different, at least biographically centered works are a little bit different, but it's tough. I tell you, and sometimes it's frustrating, but then once you find a good idea, you're excited about it and you've latched onto it and you can carry it forward. Yeah,
biography allows you a little more room for being more prosaic in your writing, and you don't. I did enjoy that aspect of that project. I'm looking for another one. And so then let's talk about how you work. Robert Caro, who I've read recently, his book on working, his book called Working, which for nonfiction writers and researchers, I think is must-read material. The insights in that book are remarkable. But you, Dan, balance your work at the library. You've got your teaching gigs with Caltech and maybe elsewhere. You're a husband and father of two. What's your process? How do you go from inspiration to research to writing to the finish line?
So, what really helps me, and I didn't used to work like this, but I've discovered that being very mechanical about certain things really helps me, because I really have incipient, attention deficit disorder, which is, in a way, it's kind of a superpower for me because it lets me pivot from one thing to the next shiny thing without too much of a break in the action. I can remember where I was. I can pick up when I come back. So I can work in fragmented fashion that way. So, and I have 1,000 distractions every day, all day long in my life.
Yeah.
And I live for like another research gig somewhere, like the Huntington somewhere else, so I can work on my own stuff without interruption. But I like to outline things. I like to build up a structure first before I can figure out exactly where I'm going to go. So I like to outline and have subcategories, and I actually work my documents like that so I can collapse and expand on outline, because there are a lot of ways for writing to go well, and there are a lot of ways for writing to go wrong. I've discovered, and one of the ways that it can go wrong is you just can't. It's like doing it. I do a lot of exhibitions at the Huntington. You can't meander too much. I mean, you're not writing a Virginia Woolf stream of consciousness prose. You want to head down a particular river a particular way.
Right.
So I tend to want to be fairly organized in terms of the structure. Once I have a structure, then I can let my freak flag fly, in terms of the language I use or the smaller directions I go within that channel. But I like to be organized these days. As I get older, I find that to be helpful because it's like filling buckets in a sense.
Right.
Writing is rewriting. It's really true. And Annie Lamott has a book called Bird by Bird. It's one of my favorite books of advice about writing. Am I allowed to swear on your show?
There's no rules.
Okay. So one of her great dictums is write shitty first draft. And it's such great advice. And what she really means by that is get something down on paper or in digital form, because you have to start somewhere. And the way you start is getting something done. And if you stall out, then you can't move forward. And so, one of the things they say about writing is, you sit there and you stare at a piece of paper until beads of blood appear on your forehead.
Yeah.
Well, you got to get past that stage to where you can get something done. So you have to start drafting, and research and writing is recursive. As I said, we've got it. You write, you come back, you research, you write. So I find the whole messy business incredibly engaging.
Yeah. So many examples of that. What you're just, things are just coming at me. I remember Ed Catmull of Pixar talking about, the first draft of every film we ever did, and the first 22 were all the biggest hits of their time, sucked. He said the first draft of your thing sucks. So when people say, I've been thinking about writing something, I just tell them, stop thinking and write.
Yeah.
The Don Revelle, back in my undergraduate days, in my poetry, one of my great poetry professors used to talk about the urgency, and the need to get to the writing. Right. A poem is never the same when it's finished as when you get it down the first time. It's getting the idea down to start to figure out what just get the bones down, and then you can build it later through that
and
process.
You can modify. Yeah. I mean, I have many sort of somewhat fragmented thoughts about the whole writing process, Ron. I had an advisor in my dissertation advisor in grad school was wonderful. And I had it pinned up to my wall for a long time. On one of my pages, he crossed the line through one of the paragraphs and he wrote, no, no, no. He said, not PG, R. He said, more sex, more violence. Like, in other words, make this something people want to read.
Yeah.
So I've always taken that to heart. And my editor at Simon & Schuster for this book I've just finished, similar. He's like, no, too much. No.
Yeah.
So,
no, it's good. And that's why we have editors, right? I mean,
that's right. It's essential. Yeah.
So let's bring the whole thing together then.
Yeah.
And talk about your next book, 12 Trees.
That had to
what's that?
I can wave it in front of the camera.
Okay. Sure. Go ahead. You got to say the name or something. So
12 Trees. 12 Trees, the deep roots of our future.
Look at that. Beautiful.
And it's got a beautiful cover by a really talented artist named Eric Nyquist. And Eric's work has shown up everywhere. He did the great illustration for Anthony Lane's review of Cocaine Bear.
Oh, nice.
Months ago. He did a great image. He told me he was given 36 hours to do this illustration and have it done. But he's very talented, and was a wonderful collaborator. So he did all 12 of the illustrations. There's one for each of the 12 trees.
Yeah, the illustrations are beautiful. I meant to make mention of that to you when we were just chatting before the program. I love the illustrations. They're great. Yeah. I have my own copy, thanks to my friend Dan. But it is anyway, I wanted to talk about, this part of the nature of research, which is sometimes you have to get on a plane or a train or an automobile and take yourself somewhere. How did the research go for you? The book talks about past and future of human development and the impact on the planet's ecosystem, basically, through the story of these 12 trees. species of trees. So yeah, can you walk
Yeah,
us through
yeah.
some of your travels and
Sure, sure. It's great fun. I had a professor in college tell me, write about places you want to go to.
right?
Like I didn't write a book about Chicago in the wintertime, for instance,
Mm, cold.
I wanted to go to the places where these 12 trees are all located. I got to most of them, but they're all over the world. They're Easter Island, Peru. They're scattered around North America. They're in Africa.
Right.
And I didn't get to all the places, but I got to many of the places. And I had some great adventures that I really make a point of recounting in the book. I got to Peru for a couple of weeks in a very, very remote part of the country. And there's a harpy eagle on the cover of the book as part of the illustration. I was on a bachelor party to go look for harpy eagle nests with a friend of mine who's a scientist and 5 of his best friends. And so we had quite an adventure down in Peru that I recount in the last chapter of the book. I really wanted to get to Easter Island, but it's expensive and it's remote, and I've got a lot going on. It's hard to get away. I did get to the amazing laboratory for tree ring research in Tucson, Arizona, which is where they study dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings, and all the things that they can learn from these tree rings. It's astonishing.
Wow.
And it's just an amazing place. So I write this up, and it's the very first chapter of the book. And I draw an analogy between books and trees, because there's a very library-like aspect to these tree rings. It's like reading the pages through time, forward and backwards in a sense. And so the traveling is fun, and you get to talk to a lot of amazing. I talked to dozens of different people, and each chapter has a hero. As my editor suggested, he said, you can be the hero of some of the chapters, but someone or something else should be the hero of the other chapters. And so I've got kind of a focal points within each of the chapters. I talked to one of the world's leading authorities on olive oil and sensory input from different. She's a certified chocolate sensor. I'm not sure what they're called. Anyway, I talked to some really fascinating scientists and humanists from around the planet. One of the things they're going to do on the works is there's a Chilean botanist who wants to bring either a seedling or some of the seeds from one of the trees I wrote about to the Huntington and give it to our garden. So there's a nice Huntington garden connection. This tree is extinct on the island. It lives only in botanic gardens around the world, but they can't get to grow on the island where it evolved on Easter Island. So the Toromiro tree, this little tree. So they're going to bring us one, and that's really a nice touch. And they'll probably do it in March when my book is about out. So
yeah. So okay, so you get to go to some of the places, but not all of the places,
right?
And I know from researching, at Yerkes, for instance, and at Mount Wilson and Palomar, and going up on, on the Big Island in Hawaii to see the Kectels,
right.
The Lowell, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
My ability, especially in the biography, where I could, really be creative in the way I told the story, more creative. Being in the place for me really helped me put the reader in the place. Can you talk about that? I mean, what was the difference between how you wrote about a tree, the trees that you actually got to visit in your research, and those that you kind of more had to take from knowledge you could gain?
Yeah. Well, place is so important in the world and for people's understanding of things, and everyone has a sense of place. And so to be able to to ground truth these stories by walking up to something. And in the Redwood chapter, I talk about touching the tree and what it's like touching a granite cliff. These trees are so big, and so you can add sense data in, right, from these in-person explorations. And I think it just makes for a much more compelling story. And I think storytelling is such an important part of writing. People are hungry for stories, and we're natural. For centuries we've been, for millennia, I think humans have been drawn to stories, both telling them and hearing them. And so being there in person gives you a chance to be a storyteller and to hear other people's stories, to hear people who are there with you. When I was in Peru, I tell the story about how I was worried I wasn't going to find this tree because they're hard to identify. They're not common. They're huge, but they're easy to confuse with other trees. And I was fretting to myself in my little journal that I was keeping that I wouldn't find this tree. And I tell the story about how we sit down for lunch one day and someone calls to me, and I turn around, and there is the biggest, most god-awful, gigantic tree I've ever seen in my life right behind me. Like, that would never have happened, obviously, remotely. So, and I told the story about being there with the tree.
Yeah.
So there's so it's just a great way to interleave personal stories about things that people find personal connections meaningful. And so that's one way to do it.
Yeah, one aspect I love about this book, and I agree, I would underscore the notion that writing about people, even if you're writing about events or things, writing about people makes it easier to humanize a story. And so it's easier to, I think it's more accessible to people if you're not just talking about stuff that happened and dates. You are actually digging into a person's life and their connection to whatever it is. Any words of advice for would-be researchers and writers, young and old? I'll give you the final word.
Be persistent. If you have a good idea that you feel really strongly about and you're passionate about, in some ways it's all about getting it out to a wider world, because if it just lives in your head, that's great. But if you can push out to other audiences, then the world learns something new and gets a chance to hear about something new and different. And so be persistent. You have to stay at it. You have to try not to get discouraged. And, writing and producing literature and knowledge is hard work. It's hard work, which is why which why everybody doesn't write a book. But it's really rewarding as a personal project, and it's good for the world, and so I encourage you to keep at it and be persistent and practice your writing. You can improve your writing. You can hone your skills. You have to read a lot to write well. You have to absorb other people's voices and figure out, if you can make use of them, at least unconsciously absorb them into your, into your writing stream. And so it's a great world. Research is a wonderful, important activity. And I'm delighted that we can be involved with it, both you and I.
Daniel Lewis is the Dibner Senior Curator for the History of Science and Technology at the Huntington Library. He can be seen in a guest appearance in the documentary film The Human Footprint. The episode is Strangers in Paradise. It's on PBS. His book, 12 Trees, The Deep Roots of Our Future, is due out in March of 2024. And I encourage everybody, I have it right here, and I encourage everybody to grab a copy when it comes out and read it. It's a really great read. And Dan, I want to thank you again very much for coming on. This was a great chat.
My pleasure, Ron. Great to talk with you, as always.
That concludes this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to like or subscribe to the show for updates on future episodes as they're published. We really appreciate the support. If you have questions or comments about or for current or future episodes, please leave them in the comments section or email them to me at contact@ronvoller.com. Bang Goes the Universe is written, produced, and hosted by me, Ron Voller. Thanks to Mark Voller for providing the theme music. We'll see you next time.